Hello, I'm Steve Pfister. I'm with Heatcraft's Center of Excellence Group, and as you're familiar with, Kysor is one of the strong brands in the Heatcraft umbrella. I'm here today to talk to you about how Heatcraft and Kysor is developing CO2 refrigerant in their new product line. As an introduction to CO2 refrigeration, we're going to talk about the history, the trends, and the characteristics of CO2 as a refrigerant. We're showing a timeline here of refrigerants and the way they've been used throughout history. You can see that CFCs were used for a long time as a dominant choice of refrigerants. Over time, this was discovered to be dangerous to the environment, along with having safety issues to people that are in close proximity and using the refrigerants. So this was transferred out with regulation and moved to R22. And now as we are progressing forward, regulations continue to improve the use of refrigerants and phase out CFCs into HCFCs and then forward into HFCs and eventually into natural refrigerants as the end game solution. In the near term, companies are evaluating HFO blends and other alternatives as a near-term solution, but down the road, natural refrigerants would offer a solution that doesn't require any more regulation. Typical regulation begins in Europe because Europeans tend to have a more progressive stance towards environmental issues. So what we've seen over the years is regulations that we see in Europe eventually show up in California and then ultimately become national policy in the United States. So as a company, we respond to these regulations by developing our products to meet the regulations. You can learn more about the specific regulations with these links shown here. The links shown under the regulations will give you an idea of what the existing regulations are in US and other countries. And also these links give you an idea of the current activity in these countries towards developing the regulations. The industry organizations that are actively monitoring the regulations and the activities of these governments are shown here, and we have several links that are useful. With the move toward natural refrigerants, we have a list of natural refrigerants to choose from. In fact, many of these natural refrigerants will be either complementing or competing for the endgame solution, which doesn't require more regulation. CO2, which is shown here on the list, is always a very good candidate since it has a GWP of 1 and an ozone depletion potential of 0. In fact, one thing that's very unique about CO2 is because it fits into the grand scheme of environmental protection, which is defined by reducing the carbon footprint and reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment, actually using the carbon dioxide as a refrigerant ends up being another part of a good solution. Some specific characteristics around CO2 are that CO2 is odorless, colorless, and that it's very common and prevalent in our environment. Everybody comes in contact with CO2. In fact, as you probably already know, we breathe out CO2 as we breathe in oxygen, and the plants around us take the CO2 and create oxygen, so it's a very symbiotic part of the cycle in the natural environment. There's a video shown here which is available online by the EPA Association that gives an overview of climate change and how CO2 is a critical part of that process that I was just describing. So in addition to that, we know CO2 is already used in beer and other products that we come in contact with. It's being used in fire extinguishers. So CO2 is nothing new for us. In fact, it's been used as a refrigerant in history, and it's seeing somewhat of a revival. As you can see in the next slide here, CO2 was patented in 1850 as a refrigerant, which is a long time ago, but it was phased out because other chemicals were invented and created for making better performance of refrigeration systems. As it turns out, these chemicals turned out to have other side effects that were not favorable, and now people are looking back to CO2 as a refrigerant again. And Gustav Lorentzen was one of the big pioneers with CO2 refrigerant, and he saw this change coming and the need for using CO2 as a natural refrigerant, and actually patented again in 1989 for a transcritical cycle. So the first CO2 system went into a supermarket in Sweden in 1995, which is not that long ago. But in this short period of time, in the last 20 years, we've seen regulations that are occurring, and we've seen enough technology being developed by the refrigeration companies that is showing CO2 is here, is available as a refrigerant, and is going to be a big part of the equation moving forward for the environmental solution. So other things that we're highlighting here is that CO2 specifically, when it is used as a refrigerant, does operate at a higher pressure, which does introduce some issues around design and safety, and we'll get into some of those details later. The beauty of CO2, as we mentioned earlier, is a natural refrigerant, is not subject to further regulation, it's not flammable, it's not non-toxic, and it's readily available. It's a cheap material, easy to extract. In the right conditions, with the right technology development, it can be performing as well as other refrigerants today. Those are the keys to making CO2 a long-term solution, is addressing the safety and the performance issues. Currently, that's being done, and it's being done in a way that we've already seen hundreds of systems introduced by Heatcraft in Europe and in the form of Cascade. The Cascade systems use CO2 at a lower pressure for the lower pressure side of the refrigeration system. In the transcritical cycle, which we're seeing more being introduced today, the CO2 is being used in a higher pressure side, which we'll get into a little bit more detail later. And Heatcraft is playing a key role in introducing the transcritical refrigeration in different parts of the world. This slide highlights the current installations that Heatcraft has around the world with CO2 transcritical systems. So in the grand scheme of things, you've got natural refrigerants that's really gaining a lot of attraction around the world with environmentalists and people that are continuing to promote natural refrigerants to replace HFCs and CFCs as refrigerants. So currently what we've got on the slide here is an overview of a survey that was done by Sheco. Sheco is a company in Europe that has been promoting the use of CO2 as a refrigerant. And in order to do this, they did a very in-depth survey to identify the barriers and drivers of using CO2 as a commercial refrigerant. This is important to us as Heatcraft and Kysor Warren, because as a company, we want to make sure that when we develop our equipment, we're focused on these drivers and barriers and making them a key part of our product development. So the outcome of this survey was that the top 3 drivers and barriers fell into these first categories here about regulation, efficiency, and performance, and then down on this other side, things that need to be improved around safety and the initial investment in getting these products into production. So what we've done at Heatcraft and Kysor Warren was made safety and performance a key part of our development so that our customers will have this advantage when we roll these out into their stores. In the United States, EPA governs the use of refrigerants. This slide shows you the current state of affairs with refrigerants in the U.S. Previously, R22 and other refrigerants have been completely phased out and are no longer used. What this chart is showing you is that for existing HFCs that are in production, they are currently being phased out with a schedule of, you can see supermarket systems are scheduled to be phasing out R404, R507, and other high GWP HFCs as early as 2017. Vending machines have the phase out in January 2019, and then remote condensing units, which are phasing out the R404 and other unacceptable refrigerants as determined by the EPA, will be phased out in 2018. Currently, for CO2 transcritical, which is where CO2 is being used at the higher pressure range, we already see a pretty good proliferation of these systems in Canada, The cooler climates are more conducive to CO2 transcritical because it's more efficient in the cooler ambient temperatures. But as we're developing CO2 transcritical going forward, we'll see that same kind of performance in the southern regions. So currently we have 52 of these systems that are installed in Europe, and you can see from the map that this is a very aggressive trend that we're seeing. So we're seeing year to year, we've gone from 2 in the US to the following year in 2014 of 14 systems, 2015 to 52. So currently we're at a period in time where we're going to see an exponential increase year to year of CO2 systems in commercial refrigeration. When you look at CO2 being used as a cascade, this is already a pretty very existing technology in production with Heatcraft and Kysor Warren and some of the other suppliers. And so you can see here that there's more of these systems currently in use. And as you look around the world, CO2 is being used very widespread as a refrigerant. So it's already here. It's not a technology that that customers should be concerned that it's something new and that they're being an experiment, or that it's an experimental refrigeration. It's already here, and we're really at a point now where we're optimizing it and expanding the options and improving the performance and making it very safe. Thank you for watching the introduction to CO2 commercial refrigeration. If you have any more questions, our videos will be online with our YouTube channel and also on the website for Heatcraft and Kysor Warren.